Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining. We'll just wait a little more for people to joining, and then we will start. All right, so I can see that people have joined us. Hello again, I'm Sofia KABBEJ. I'm a research fellow on climate and security and geoengineering at the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs in Paris. And I'm very happy to be moderating this webinar on the intersection of climate and security today. Before starting, I would like to thank our partners from the Center for Climate and Security, as well as the US Embassy in Paris for the support. We hope that such initiatives can increase cooperation between France and the US on the crucial issue that is climate security. And indeed, climate security is a crucial issue. From heat waves to cyclone floods and other impacts of climate change, it is increasingly visible that populations all over the world are impacted, and military are not exempt. So this webinar will aim to basically introduce how climate and security are interconnected, but also what governments, and especially the US and France, are doing to respond to this issue. To do so, I'm very happy to welcome 4 leading experts in the climate security field for the next hour and a half. So Julia TASSE, hello.
Hello.
You're the head of the Climate, Energy and Security Program at the French Institute of International and Strategic Affairs. And we will be introducing the linkages between climate and security, but also presenting French initiatives, the Observatory on Defense and Climate. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Adrien, hello.
Hi.
Thank you for joining us. You are a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for International Studies at Sciences Po, and you have worked as part of your PhD on the integration of climate change by the US Department of Defense and the French Ministry of Armed Forces. And you will present us the similarities and differences between how those 2 countries approach climate security. Thank you for joining. Kate, hello, Kate Guy.
Hi, thanks.
Kate, you're a senior research fellow at the Center for Climate and Security, and you will be presenting us the International Military Council on Climate and Security, a unique initiative of which you are Deputy Director. Thank you. Hello, Erin SIKORSKY.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining. You're the director of the International Military Council on Climate and Security, and we will be presenting us the main takeaways of the 2021 World Climate Security Report, which will allow participants to understand the key risks and opportunities that are associated with climate security. Thank you all again for being with us. We look forward to hearing you, but before starting, I'm very also happy to welcome Elizabeth MARTIN-SHUKRUN, who's the cultural advisor at the US Embassy in Paris, and will now give some introductory remarks. Elizabeth, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for being here and joining us for this important discussion. The US Embassy and consulates here in France are really pleased to support tonight's event in the series that we are supporting with IRIS to explore these issues of how climate change is already and unfortunately will continue to play a role in issues of international security and national defense. As I'm sure most of you know, one of President Biden's first acts of office in January of this year was to re-enter the Paris Climate Agreement. And in fact, his administration has made it a clear priority to address the causes of climate change, mitigate its effects, and work with countries around the world to support those regions and communities that are most affected by climate change. The president has elevated this issue to one of national security, tasking the United States 18 intelligence agencies with producing a national intelligence estimate on the security implications of climate change. So as our Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin said back in April at the President's Leaders Summit on Climate, today no nation can find lasting security without addressing the climate crisis. Climate change is making the world more unsafe, and we need to ask. So really tonight's discussion between our French and our American experts will dive into the impacts of climate change on defense and security. As Sophia mentioned earlier, this has implications in increased competition in the Arctic, for example, to addressing extreme weather events, drought, hunger, displacement of people. The climate crisis really threatens not only American national security, but global peace and prosperity. As Secretary Austin noted in April, shared threats demand shared solutions. And it's really only through collaboration between France and the United States, and among France, the United States, and our global allies, that we'll be able to truly make a difference. France and the US have long been partners in addressing the most complicated challenges on the global stage, and that remains the case with climate change. We really hope that tonight's discussion and subsequent events in the series with Iris will spark the needed discussions and awareness of these issues and really lead to even greater collaboration between our two countries. So thanks very much to our partners at Iris, thanks to our expert speakers from CERI and CSS, and I'm really looking forward to learning more from your exchange, and we at the Embassy look forward to supporting new areas for Franco-American collaboration on addressing climate change and its implications on national security. So thanks very much and have a great discussion.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for taking the time to join us and for those remarks. Before starting and leaving the floor to the panelists, I would like to remind all participants that we will have 30 minutes dedicated to question and answers at the end of this webinar. You have a question and answer icon at the bottom of your screen where you can drop off your question all along the way, and I will make sure to address those at the dedicated time. Thank you. So as Elizabeth starting to highlight, climate and security are linked in many different ways, and research on this topic has been going on for some time now. Julia, I will now leave you the floor so that you can introduce exactly how it is that climate and security are related. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So as Elizabeth said, the aim of this webinar is to spark discussion, and I'm sure that we all have different concept in mind when we talk about security. So I'm just going to start my presentation by describing the link between climate and security, and I would be happy to be challenged by other panelists or the audience on what I've presented, because this is still an ongoing discussion. So when we talk about the link between climate change and security, what we first think about are extreme weather events. But as we can see, climate change has many cascading effects on human societies. And what I will just do in the next minute will be, I will try to unravel what all those links could be. So they could be related to human security, as we'll see, but also to national security. And I think that's an important statement to keep in mind. So first, quick reminder, climate change effects and impacts on human societies are very different from one place to another. And we could face droughts, we could face marine floods, we could face melting permafrost. Wherever we are on Earth, we will face climate change impact. And that's important because it will directly affect global security, because it will affect global societies. And among those different impacts, some will impact directly cities or very populated areas. Other will impact key sectors in the economy, and all of them will have to be considered by security and defense communities. So what will be consequences of climate change on human systems? First, I would like to come back to what we could consider as four concepts of security. So environmental security, which is linked to the ability of a natural environment to provide support for life. Human security, which is rather focused on humans, of course, and the ability to provide protection of fundamental condition, living condition, or fundamental freedoms. Global security that Kate had briefly mentioned during her introduction, and also Elizabeth. So how international organizations can work together to ensure security and peace at the global scale, and national security, which is much more related to what we consider as defense of a national territory, of a population, of economy and institution of a state. And climate change will affect the four of them. Of course, environmental security is the first we think about because climate change will have an impact on natural environment, but it will also affect human security and food security, for example. It will affect global security because international organizations will be facing multiple challenges at the same time, and they will have to deal with all of them. And national security, because I think it's also mainly part of the conversation we could have tonight. National security is really focusing on defense and defense of a territory. But when we consider the interlinkage between national security and, for example, energy flows, energy providing energy providers and everything, we'll see that food, energy depend on an international flows that could be affected directly by climate change. And just to focus more on few different sectors, climate change will directly impact agriculture, energy infrastructure, and transportation infrastructure. When we consider, for example, water stress, we can see that even that's a map showing what could be water stress in a positive scenario of the IPCC, the International Group of Climate Experts. And in 2040, that could be the water stress level around the world. So that will directly impact people and agriculture. So when we consider the links between climate change and security, we can ask ourselves what phenomena could arise and potentially lead to tension or conflicts. And the first fact we think about, especially since yesterday with the World Bank report on population displacement, we can think about population displacement due to natural disaster or gradual degradation of their environment. We could also think about resource competition that could due to water stress, for example, or agricultural stress, but it is also relevant for newly reachable zones. And Elizabeth talked about the Arctic. This is a perfect example of a zone that will be more accessible due to climate change and could trigger interest from different actors, whether they be states or private actors, and that could also lead to tensions. And the third one, and I will then leave the floor to the rest of the panelists because we might not all be agreeing on those facts, is that what we could call transitional risk is the fact that states and stakeholders will try to adapt and address climate change, and those policies, those transition policies, could also affect security in all its different concepts. And that is also something we have to consider because there is not only adaptation and mitigation to climate change, there is also considering the impact of those policies on security around the world. So I know there is still a lot to say, and I will leave the floor to the rest of the panelists to continue the conversation.
Thank you very much, Julia, for this great introduction that allows us to see the diversity of ways in which climate and security can be perceived, can be approached, and thus can be addressed by different political levels, whether it is national, regional, or international. And talking about responses, there are two countries who appear to be leaders on climate security responses. They are the United States and France. And we have the chance today to receive Adrien ESTEVE, who did his PhD on this topic, among other issues, I believe, but that was something you addressed. I will now leave you the floor so that you can present us how exactly it is that those two countries integrated climate security. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sofia. Thank you very much. Thank you also for organizing the panel, and thanks to the US Embassy. We are able to have this great discussion between French and American experts, and I think that's very important because, yes, as French speakers, we tend not to speak English, we tend not to exchange in English, but I think it's very important now that we have, let's say, a global research agenda, basically, on climate change and security. We should be able to share our research and have these kinds of meetings. I think that's very important. So we share my screen now. So here it is. So it is in full screen, I think.
I believe, yes, now it is. Thank you.
Okay, great. So as you can see, my presentation is on how the defense sector in France and the United States started to tackle the issue of climate change. And I think first and foremost, I would like to begin with the warnings we received this year on why climate change is such an important issue for national security actors and for the defense sector in particular. So of course, you may know, you may be aware of the IPCC report that was published in August. And this report is very important for us as climate security experts, let's say persons who are interested in climate security, because it clearly says that we will have this increase of climate security risks globally, at a global level. And not only, as that not only in certain regions that were previously particularly of interest for France and the United States. For example, the Sahel region for France, we always consider that climate change will have an impact in the Sahel region, and we are right. But now the Sahel region is not the only region in the world that will be impacted by climate change. We saw in Europe, we saw in China, we saw in the US, in Canada, that we have strong climate-induced catastrophes that already, I would say, have a strong, imply a strong involvement of the security forces and the armed forces in particular, to rescue the population, to rebuild also sometimes some parts of the countries. So the IPCC report gives us some additional data on why is it so important to work on climate security now. And the other report, I think I won't be long on this report, but because the other panelists will probably be better. That's the World Climate and Security Report. I highly encourage you to read it. It's the IMCCS, so the International Intelligence in Climate and Security. It got published earlier this year, and it's also a good source of information if you want to see why and how climate change will have an impact, a security impact in the world. So of course, as a person who worked on the defense sector and the climate change, I would like to give you a bit of context on why and how the defense sector began to address this issue. And in the US, you know, we come out of what we could call the dark age of climate security, because of course the Trump administration really didn't quite believe in climate change as we saw with the withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, with the nomination of clear persons who didn't believe in climate change to the Environmental Protection Agency at the beginning of the administration. Also, some programs, especially a Navy program on climate change, got canceled by the Trump administration during the past few years. So we see that we were not off to a good start. But I would like to say that something emerged from this, let's say, criticism of climate security, and that was some studies. We have to be we have to really look into it and see the studies. But these studies really, I think, gave us a good idea of, I would say, how climate and security are becoming more and more important, even in a clearly hostile administration. And I mentioned here one study in particular, a study conducted by the Strategic Environmental Research and Development Program of the Department of Defense, which clearly show there is no, they clearly show to prove that small islands will be at risk in the future, and also small islands where there are military installations and US military installations. And they focus particularly on, of course, the US military installations, but France also has military installations abroad and overseas. So we'll see that there is a risk of sea level rise at these military installations in the near future. Also, second thing I would like to stress is the fact that even under the Trump administration, so a clearly hostile administration, you had studies. Of course, the Congress was behind this push for studies, but still there are studies on the most vulnerable military bases on US and foreign soil. And this was a list established by the US Armed Forces. So the Navy, the Army, the Marine Corps, the Air Force also into 2019. And we see clearly that some of them are at huge risk of sea level rise, for example, but also wildfires for some of them, especially in the desert. So we see that even under the Trump administration, there is a clear connection between climate change and national security. And of course, the Biden administration comes back to what the Obama administration did, which is treating climate change as the real national security issue that it is. And especially coming back to the definition of climate change as a threat multiplier, something that's an expression we know when we work on climate security, but it's important here, I think, to stress the fact that climate change is now considered by both French and the American military as a threat multiplier, a risk multiplier. And of course, the Biden administration began with a very important executive order on tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. This led to the creation of a climate group, the climate task force at the Department of Defense. This led to declarations, official statements by the new Secretary of Defense, Austin, on the connection between climate and security. And this also allowed some components of the US military, such as the US Army, to write clearly in their Arctic strategy that climate change will have a strong impact on US national security interests in the near future, especially in the Arctic region. So on the French side, we didn't have Trump, of course, as a president, but we did have Emmanuel Macron, who, at the opposite, really believed in climate change and really believed in the importance of climate politics, climate policies. So, of course, after the COP21, so that was under the Hollande presidency, and after the creation of what Julia just mentioned, the Observatory on Defense and Climate at the Ministry of the Armed Forces, the French military doctrine really imported the idea of climate change as a threat multiplier. Okay, and it clearly stated in its 2017 main strategic document that climate change is a national security issue, should be considered as a national security issue. There is a full paragraph on the matter, and particularly the document highlights the importance of the Sahel region and Southeast Asia, for example, for French national interests. The problem in France, and is very different from the problem you had in the US, is that the issue is fragmented within the Ministry of the Armed Forces. So we have very different bureaus and personnel who work on the issue, but never talk to each other. And that was the case for a very, very long time. I think the Observatory did a good job by talking to everybody inside the ministry, but I think there's still a problem, the fragmentation of the issue within the Ministry of the Armed Forces. There is no clear person in charge of climate security. There is no clear office in charge of climate security. And especially there is no such office at the highest level of command, the highest level of responsibility within the Ministry of the Armies. And especially the Chief of Defense Staff. So there is nobody in charge really of the issue at the moment at the Ministry of the Armed Forces. So it's a governance issue. And I think that we are coming now in 2021, 2020, it's starting to emerge. I mean, something is going maybe to change in the near future. I hope so. I know the observatory may be conducted for additional years. I hope so. But also we have strong statements from our Ministry of Defense, Ministry of the Armed Forces, Florence Parly, last week. She clearly said that climate change, that the armed forces have a huge, should participate in climate governance and should be able to tackle climate change. So it's a very strong statement from French Ministry of Defense. And the former French Chief of Defense Staff, he got evicted last July, but it clearly said in a conference in May, sorry, that the French armed forces should be ready to deal with climate change, okay, in the near future. So that's two strong statements. We didn't have many of them in the previous years. Two strong statements this year from French military officials. And as a conclusion, like in just 1 minute, I would like to stress the importance of international cooperation on the matter. And so that's something we didn't have before. So the IMCCS is doing a great job, I think, at creating a community of not only experts, but also officials on the issue of climate security and the connection between defense and climate change. NATO is also taking action this year. They put together this climate change and security action plan that I recommend you read for all of us, but also for the audience, because it's a clear summary of I would say, both the French and the American perception on climate security. It's a very, very interesting document. And the European Union, and that's a surprise for me because I was always frustrated by the lack of interest of the European Union and the connection between defense and climate change. But right now, they are starting to create a special unit on this issue, and they have a clear climate change defense and crisis management plan. So that's also very recent. And I hope that the European Union will become a great player in these debates in the near future. I thank you all, and I'm sorry for being too long. Maybe.
Thank you, Adrien. You were definitely not too long, and it was extremely interesting. Thank you for sharing the results of your research with us and with the participants. Actually, we're now going to dive in one of the things you mentioned during your presentation, which is the Observatory on Defense and Climate, an initiative that was launched by the Ministry for Armed Forces here in France. I will now leave the floor to Julia, who was one of the co-directors of this observatory.
Okay, thank you. And this will be me again, and then I stop talking. So let me share my screen as well. And can you see my screen? Great. So yes, this observatory, as Adrien said, has been implemented in 2016. The idea, I think, was launched during COP21, so in Paris. All ministries during COP21 were invited to participate in the efforts to integrate climate change in their activities, and the Ministry for Armed Forces was part of this initiative. It first gathered ministers from all over the world, defense ministers, during an off-site event during COP21, and this was followed by the idea of really creating an expert group on the intersection between climate change and geopolitical security and defense matter. And IRIS is a think tank that was associated with this initiative. So 3 logos that you can see on the slides are the following, from left to right. So the logo of IRIS, the think tank that is conducting this research program, the logo of the Department for International Relations and Strategy of the Ministry of Armed Forces in France, which is our contacts in the Ministry for Armed Forces, and the logo of the Observatory for Defense and Climate, which is the research program. So launched in around 4 or 5 years ago, and it ended, as Adrien said, really recently. So I cannot say that I'm a co-director of it anymore, because the program doesn't exist anymore, but we hope that it will be launched again to continue our work and dive deeper into the intersection between climate and defense. To come back to the main missions of this observatory, they were threefold. So the first one was to understand the dynamics and stakes when we talk about intersection between climate and defense. The second one was to help the ministry anticipate global changes and risks, and to do so, we were producing reports. And the third one that was partly our task and partly the ministry's task was to adapt policies and response. So we were producing recommendations and hoping for the ministry to integrate them. The objectives were, we had six objectives. So, and they were really different from each other and requiring really different scientific competencies. So the first one was to help anticipate geomorphological and physical changes in operational fields. And for that, we worked with climate scientists. The second was to assess impacts on range of defense missions. And to do so, we were, of course, working with climate scientists, but also with specialists in defense, security, and specialists from the ministry. The third one was to adapt the capabilities, the capacities, the policies, and the doctrine of the Ministry for Armed Forces. And as scientists, we could only recommend or highlight interesting doctrine or policy suggestion. What we also worked on was to avoid normative constraint due to mitigation needs. So what we mean by that is that we helped the ministry anticipate the fact that they will have to mitigate their impact on climate change. And we wanted to avoid having them constrained by that in the next years. So to anticipate what it could require and adapt their equipment and infrastructure to such norms. The fifth one that you can see on the screen is to prevent risks for France and its sphere of influence. And I think that's a key objective that we had and we worked on for the past 5 years. So we mapped different parts of the world and how climate change could impact the economy and the social spheres of those regions and what could it mean for France. And finally, what I was just talking about, the understanding of the correlation between climate change and conflict and how one could lead to each other and how we could work on those links to reduce the risk for tensions and violence. What does it mean? It means that on the 5 last years, we produced different reports, some of them on different areas of the world. So we first worked on the Sahel and the West African region. Then we went eastward towards East Africa, towards South Asia, the Pacific, Southeast Asia. And we then aimed for Americas, so Central and South America. And we were aiming at working on the Caribbean, but we didn't have the time. So maybe it will be our next tasks. And so each of those reports covered the few countries in the regions, their vulnerability to climate change, and what could it mean for France in terms of defense and security. So we published 2 global, I would say, transversal reports and a few other that were thematics. 9, as I just presented, regional foresighting reports, 38 country notes, so analysis of country by country, what could be the risks. We also had, we followed recent events and news during those 5 years, and that led us to publish 24 analysis and 6 thematic analysis notes. And we also organized 4 conferences around the world on that topic. The aim of this observatory was really to provide the ministry with information on what could be the link between climate change and security and what could be its meaning for France. That's it. The rest of the slides were just to provide more information if we need at the end of the session. So I will finish here.
Great. Thank you so much, Julia. That was very interesting. I mean, I'm not going to act surprised because I already knew it, but thank you for highlighting it. And well, this is a clear example of how a government and especially a Ministry for Armed Forces is trying to respond to a new emerging issue. But beyond governance, there are also researchers as ours, and the research field is extremely active. As part of this, we're very happy to be welcoming the Deputy Director of the International Military Council on Climate and Security, KABBEJ, and its Director, Erin, SIKORSKY. I will let you maybe introduce to our audience these initiatives, what it aims to do. And it's truly, to me, actually, it's an illustration of how we can cooperate together to respond to climate security. And it's truly been amazing to work with everyone in this initiative. So, Kate, I will now give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Sofia, and yes, couldn't agree more on the just new heights of cooperation that we are finding working together. So, hello, bonsoir, merci de m'avoir invité. Wish I could be there with all of you in Paris doing this in person, but luckily we won't have to sort of sit through my bad French and can do it virtually online. Yes, as Sofia said, as Adrien did a great job sort of setting up, I'm going to quickly introduce to you what this IMCCS is. That's our name for the International Military Council on Climate and Security, of which both IRIS and the Center for Climate and Security, which is my home institution, are a part of. And it really fits into what I think we would all see as an exciting acceleration of attention and prioritization of this issue of climate and its impacts on security and the climate problem more generally, right? Especially since 2015 and the Paris Agreement, we've seen just a real takeoff of action and interaction on this global challenge. Unfortunately, we've also seen a takeoff of risks, and that's some of which we'll talk about tonight. But I really just wanted to outline, sort of where things stand in terms of global cooperation on these issues, and hopefully what we'll see sort of going forward. So as Adrien pointed out, research on the intersection of climate and security has been around for many decades at this point. Many countries at different times have sort of tapped their toes into the pond of looking at these risks, but for multiple reasons, political winds have often brought that back and sort of deprioritized the issue. And obviously, activity is now sort of at a new level of engagement, in part because the risks are so much higher and so much more present in the world today than they ever have been. What's little advanced beyond the research until this moment, unfortunately, has been policy to address these threats or to build resilience to these threats. So we've seen both at the domestic and international level sort of a dearth of real good prioritization and policy about what to do about these threats. There's been a good number of research. Within the US, we at the Center for Climate and Security have been working for years to really move this, to move beyond just the research and anticipation of threats, which we of course do a lot of, but to actually build cooperation in this area. So among researchers, among think tanks, but especially among security actors, right? So governments, militaries, diplomats, and the like. And it's not just been us doing this in the US, other groups have been embarking on similar projects around the world. You've just heard IRIS talk about the work they've done in France and in Europe. The Planetary Security Initiative as well brought many of these global actors together for a few years of excellent conferences in The Hague. And we really realized quickly that this was something we needed to join forces on. We're allies in more ways than one. And on this issue, it really takes sort of a global collaboration of effort on these topics. And this is, not something that is frequently done in a lot of areas, specifically climate security. So in 2019, a few of the leading groups working on this issue came together to form a new partnership, which became the International Military Council on Climate and Security. So together, these groups now form the IMCCS Consortium or expert group. So that is IRIS in France, Clingendael Institute in the Netherlands, the Hague Center for Security Studies, for Strategic Studies, also of the Netherlands, the Center for Climate and Security in the US, and recently just joined by the Australian Security Leaders Climate Group out of Australia. So the point of bringing all these groups together was to, our mission statement is anticipate, analyze, and address the security risks of a changing climate. In practice, it's really clear that each of these groups, we all have our own fortes, right? We all have regions of analysis that are particularly important to us. We each have really important connections to security decision makers in our home governments, in our regions. And we realized to have greater impact at both the policy and the research levels, it made sense to combine these areas of expertise and to undertake joint research and engagement. So our first big collaboration really landed with a splash, I can say, in early 2020. And that was the launch of the inaugural World Climate and Security Report. So this is the report that many people have already mentioned. Erin, our director, is going to give an overview of the 2021 version of this report, which came out earlier this year. But it was a harried effort even to bring the first report together, I can say, and to try to give a snapshot of what we're seeing in terms of climate security risks around the world at this moment in time. We launched the 2020 report in February of 2020 at the Munich Security Conference, which was really one of the last big in-person engagements for the international security community, particularly before another big borderless existential risk shut down the world, which was the COVID-19 pandemic. And frankly, there's a lot to be learned from what happened there for the climate risks as well, some of which we do in the 2021 report and definitely requires more analysis. But that launch back in early 2020, frankly, kicked off 2 incredibly busy years, or a year and a half has felt like 2 years of really busy engagement and activity and publications among the IMCCS. So we've had many senior military and diplomatic leaders from around the world join the IMCCS, and they join us looking for specific expertise and regional analysis and policy advice and the like. We've in a similar way, worked with many governments, worked with NATO, worked with the United Nations to elevate climate in their work. We've been present, importantly, in both climate spaces, so in the UNFCCC COP negotiations, for example, but also really present primarily in security spaces that don't often get climate experts speaking within them, like Munich, like GlobeSec in Eastern Europe, the security engagements in the Pacific as well. And in those spaces, we're really educating decision makers on these intersecting risks and the overlapping risks that they might not otherwise be getting information on. And primarily what we're pushing for in all of these spaces is one of our top recommendations from the first World Climate and Security Report, which is that we need to start climate proofing our security operations, right? That each military, each government needs to be looking at specifically how they're going to be building resilience to the climate risks that are going to be interrupting and interacting with their security work. That can be their security environments that they're operating in, that can be the infrastructure that they are overseeing, and that can more importantly be the institutions which we're a part of, alliances and the like at the international level, which are seeing new and building risks from climate change. So lastly, we've also done a lot of groundbreaking research beyond the World Climate and Security Report, which is at a more regional level. The IMCCS has put out reports on climate security in the Indo-Asia Pacific, in South America and Brazil, in South Asia and Southeast Asia separately. We've done foresight analysis through a global threat perception survey for 2 years running to look at how experts think these risks will evolve. And then this is, of course, on top of the work that each of our organizations are doing individually, right? From the incredible work on the Sahel that IRIS is doing. We've increasingly at CCS done a lot more work on the Arctic and climate security risks there. The Hague Center has been doing risk modeling, all the like, and so we're able to really do this together. So, you know, since we launched just 2 years ago, we've seen an explosion of demand, frankly, from security actors to think about these risks, to integrate these risks. As our US partner said, the Biden administration has prioritized these issues to new heights, particularly with our allies, right, in the US. And the world has taken note of this new level of leadership. And I doubt, frankly, that we're going to see a retraction of this leadership in the way that Adrien said we recently did. And that's just because as security decision makers, they're now faced, they can't deny these threats any longer. They're at the forefront of so many of the security operations that any country is involved in, and they cannot be denied. And these risks are only just growing, right? From tension in the Pacific, tension in the Arctic, growing displacement in equatorial regions, and increasingly dangerous impacts to the homeland, right? In the US and Europe just this summer, we saw the toll that climate risks are taking. And so we can only imagine in that situation, IMCCS will see much more work that we'll have to undertake, hopefully new partners to undertake the work with, and increasingly, hopefully, global climate proofing of our security cooperation, and less sort of mitigating the risks that we otherwise could be embarking on. So I'll stop there and kick it over to Erin, who will give you more of the deep details of our work. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Kate. Well, you've done a great job introducing Adrien, so I don't need to do anything more. I will leave you now the floor, Adrien, to introduce the results of this week.
Thank you so much. I'm just going to need to tell my colleague to turn off the vacuum here for 1 second. I'll be right back.
You know the joys of Zoom. This is, yeah.
I'm so sorry about that. The perils of working from home. You occasionally get these issues, but let me share my screen here. Can you all see? Great. So what I'm going to do is talk about the World Climate and Security Report in a little more detail, which both Adrien and Kate have already mentioned. But before we jump into the details of that report, I did want to highlight two different pieces, both one on the International Military Council on Climate and Security that Kate talked about, and then also going back to this earlier discussion about how we define national security in the realm of climate change. So one thing I will say about IMCCS that I think the benefit of engaging with security leaders on climate issues is it brings different actors to the table within state governments who advocate for action on climate change then. So I think beyond the realm of national security, you also get defense ministers, foreign ministers coming to their governments, right, and saying we need to take action to mitigate, we need to cut emissions because these climate security risks will be so great. And so I think that's part of the benefit of a group like this as well, particularly in countries where action hasn't been as strong on climate change in the past. And to that end, getting back to this discussion of national security, and as we think about the World Climate Security Report and analyzing these risks, you know, Julia talked about the different ways we define climate national security. And I think we've seen an evolution, right, from a point where states were the primary risk, right, that we were looking at, to post 9/11, looking at non-state actors. And then as Kate mentioned, now with the COVID-19 crisis, and we're in a world where many folks are looking at what we call actorless risks, right? These systemic threats that cross borders and require cooperation. And I think when we talk about climate change and the national security risk, you've seen also a change over time, right? Away from just thinking about infrastructure and militaries and what it means for them, but what does it mean writ large for conflict and violence and security risks more broadly, which brings me to the World Climate and Security Report. So our second report we released this June around the time of the NATO ministerial. And the report itself is a real mix of the three things that Kate mentioned that IMCCS does, right? To anticipate, analyze, and address climate security risks. So there's a section that looks at specific regions of the world in detail and what the risks are there. But there's also a section on building new tools to address these risks. And then also what are some interventions we might take that security institutions may take to address these risks on the ground? How do we evaluate those? How do we determine what works and what doesn't? And what I want to talk about very briefly is what were the key findings of this report. As Adrien mentioned, it's a big report. There's a lot in it. I'd encourage everyone to check it out. And so I'm just going to hit the wave tops today, but happy in the Q&A to delve more deeply into different areas as needed. But the key findings on the risk side, I think if you think about the events of this summer and the climate hazards, the climate crises we've seen on nearly every continent, you will see that many of these risks are already playing out, as other speakers have mentioned. These aren't far off into the future. They're here today, and we're already dealing with them. So the first risk that we identified is that climate security risks are compound or cascading in nature. The most severe risks we face are when climate change intersects with other threats, whether it's the COVID-19 pandemic, whether it's poor governance, years of mismanagement, as we saw, say, in Iran this summer with the protests in the streets over the water crisis there. It wasn't just the drought or the high temperatures, it was poor governance in managing the water crisis for many years. And when those things intersect, that's when you hit a critical security risk point. And so that was a key theme throughout the entire report, was the compound nature. The second key finding, and this has already come up in the discussion, is that no region of the world is immune. This isn't just a problem in certain parts of the world, this is a problem everywhere. And as the pace and intensity of climate hazards grow, it's harder and harder for even wealthy regions of the world to deal with these things, right? You're barely recovering from one crisis before the next one hits. And so you're always behind and trying to catch up. The third area of risk is that militaries and security services are increasingly overstretched. Again, something we saw this summer as countries around the world called on their militaries to fight fires, to rescue folks from floods, to deal with population displacements within and between countries in response to climate hazards. And the things they're overstretched by are not only these direct infrastructure risks, but also social disruptions, which we'll see more and more of going forward. The fourth key finding was that when we look at climate security interventions, right, when we're trying to address climate security risks on the ground, if these do not account for local dynamics or conditions, you can actually exacerbate the risk of conflict and violence and security problems. And I think this is an interesting conundrum we face with climate change and climate security. It's a global phenomenon. It's something that is shared amongst all countries, yet when we actually see the risks play out at a local level, they're very, there's a lot of difference, right? Depending on the region, depending on the local dynamics. And so having a local understanding of community, bringing community actors into climate security discussions is critically important. And I think there's a lot of work to be done here on understanding the role of climate change issues in peace building and conflict prevention, and is an area I think where a lot of good work can be done going forward to understand these risk dynamics. And the fifth key finding we have here, and again, I think this has come up in our conversation and we see it play out, but the global governance system is ill-equipped to manage the risks, right? The challenges and risks we face from climate change and climate security are mismatched to the toolbox we have to deal with them. I know this is something Sofia knows a lot about when it comes to geoengineering, but I think you can pick almost any issue related to climate security and the governance system we have, both at the global level, but also then within a lot of countries, wasn't designed for the world we now inhabit and will inhabit going forward. So those are the five key areas of risk from the report, but of course, we found opportunities as well going forward. And again, I don't think any of these are a huge surprise, but I think they're important to think about. The first one, since we released the report in June, we've seen this a bit over the summer, but there's an opportunity around leadership, right, from the US, from the EU and NATO as we approach COP26 in November. We've already seen that with the NATO Climate Security Action Plan. The US has continued to put these things forward, the EU as well. I think, unfortunately, as Kate mentioned, a lot of the action has been around assessing risk or agreeing that risk exists. But then now the challenge is, okay, what do we actually do about it? And that's where it's much harder, and more leadership will continue to be needed, but at least the conversation is happening. And you're seeing countries who previously have not addressed climate change in their national security strategies now doing so. Japan in their defense white paper this year for the first time mentioned climate change. Even Russia in its national security strategy mentioned climate change this year for the first time. So you're seeing the conversation happening more and more. The second opportunity is around climate proofing development and conflict prevention in fragile and brittle states. I talked about a little bit this before, but bringing together climate practitioners with peace builders in regions to figure out how to link these issues. We can also integrate predictive modeling and risk assessment methodologies into regional security plans and force readiness assessments. This is what I like to call mainstreaming climate security across all aspects of the defense and foreign policy establishment in countries, right? It can't just be off in its own office somewhere where the climate people work, but it needs to be within every regional shop, every forward deployed regional command. As they think about the risks they're facing, they have to bring that climate lens. And the good news is, because of the foresight capabilities we have related to climate change, there's a lot of good data and risk methodology they can bring to these issues going forward. And the fourth and fifth opportunities here, the fourth is security institutions leading by example toward reducing greenhouse gas emissions. This is more and more a part of the conversation. I also think this is the hardest part of the conversation for a lot of defense institutions to think about, and something that I think IMCCS and other groups can be real leaders on, and helping them think through these challenges. And then finally, updating and developing international law and norms to better include climate security impacts, whether it's migration or geoengineering, but bringing that climate lens to match the world we are in today, which requires flexibility, requires being more nimble, requires moving very quickly. I think that, again, what we saw this summer is these risks are already here, and so we're already behind in taking action. But ideally, through the work of groups like IRIS, through Center for Climate and Security, the work of scholars like Adrien, we can move these issues forward. I think I'll stop there in describing the report itself. Happy to dig into any other issues, and we've got many of the authors of the report on this video today, so we can chat about it. But thank you so much, and I apologize again for my issue at the beginning here.
No problem with that. That's all fine. Thank you so much for presenting us those curious key opportunities. I think it really gave the audience the array of things, in the complexity also of the issue now. I'm very happy to be opening now the question and answer section. I invite all participants, and we're starting having some questions now to write them directly in the chat. I will address them to our panelists on the spot, and starting with a question on the global governance as a toolbox. Sorry. So research shows that there's a complexity gap at executive levels. So basically, the thinking doesn't match the degree of complexity of the issue. The question is from Danwa Jones: did any of the research touch on the thinking agility of decision makers? I think that, yeah, that is quite a good question. Maybe Erin, would you like to go with it?
Sure. I'll say the World Climate Security Report itself doesn't really talk about the thinking agility of leaders, but I think that's absolutely a critical point, and something we work on a lot at the Center for Climate and Security is, how do you build a climate strong workforce, for example? What kind of things do you need to do to build leaders that can address these issues, and leaders that can think about things in terms of systemic risk is critical. And that, frankly, is a mindset shift, I think, for not all, but many national security practitioners. It's a different way of approaching risk as opposed to threat, right? And what those risks come from. And I think it's absolutely needed. I think it's hard. It's changing culture, right, of organizations, and it's changing how you educate and train people. But I would argue you see folks who are thinking that way within the U.S. government at leadership levels on these issues. The challenge is, how do you make that expand throughout entire organizations, right? Not just at the very top, but through the mid-level folks as well. And it's something I think we can all need to work on more.
Any of the panelists would like to add something? Thank you, Erin. No?
Maybe just to jump on that questions regarding the agility of decision makers, whether it be for defense or security matters or more social or economical stakes, there is a need for action when it comes to climate. And what we can feel is that when it's the security community that is highlighting the risks, climate risks, it can influence decision makers and especially politicians in integrating climate change into their policies faster. The community itself, the defense community, has very long-term agendas, so their agility is limited, but they might influence politics in tackling climate change faster. We hope so.
Thank you, Julia. There's a question related to the report. Actually, Dan Jones asking if the foresight methodologies are included in it. Yeah, well, maybe let Erin or Kate reply to this technical question.
Sure, I'm happy to. So we don't do an overview of multiple foresight methodologies, though that's a really great idea and one we should probably do at some point of looking at different tools, particularly that intelligence communities have to assess and analyze these issues. That would probably be a nice addition to the toolbox is doing that. What we do in the report is I guess maybe 3 different foresight methodologies are sort of within the report. The first is the majority of the report is written in a sort of scenario modeling sort of context, not specifically, but I think it could easily be read that way, right? Of pick a region, read up on that region, and sort of imagine the scenario that you find yourself in with the risks that are described, which are mostly ongoing risks, but especially sort of how they evolve into the future. If you're interested in that sort of scenario-based work, the Center for Climate and Security has done a lot of that in the past couple of years. So definitely encourage you to look at both the regional reports in that context, as well as a few other global reports we've done. But certainly, you know, that scenario sort of work is some of the best foresight methodologies that can be used with security makers, because it really sort of puts their mind in where we'll be in 10 years, 15 years, et cetera. The other big sort of foresight methodology we use is, I mentioned the climate threat perception survey, climate security threat perception survey, which we did for the inaugural report and then followed up and expanded for the 2021 report. And that is a survey of, frankly, global climate security experts from around the world, and really trying to assess where they see threats at this moment in time, 10 years from now and 20 years from now, across a very wide range of climate security threats. Both sort of risking or sort of asking how will those risks evolve into the future, as well as how they'll likely interact with each other. So there's really good data in there, which I think is hard to get, basically, and one way is through expert survey. The last methodology that's in there and is going to be built upon is more of this risk modeling side of work. Now, this is something that many groups around the world are now eagerly engaged in. You know, how do you integrate the social factors, especially the security risk factors, into climate models that already exist in the more physical sciences routes? This is really hard to do and you know, obviously problematic to try to model human activity and social factors. But the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, which is one group that we work with, has started to do some of that risk modeling. Again, it's less of a future risk model and more of a like, where can we anticipate risks happening in the world as we see it now under the models we currently have. But you'll see that in the report, and it's hopefully something we can build on further. But great question.
Thank you so much, Kate, for this precise question. I think it should answer the question of the participant. I would like to take another question that I think will follow up on the discussion you initiated, Erin, but also what we have been talking on with the presentation of Adrien early on, the question of leadership, a question being on what is the benefit of leadership in that situation, taking maybe the other side and saying that isn't it a question of who will still be able to hold the big gun. So we go back to this realist perspective of international relations. So why would leadership be important in responding to climate security? I'll let the floor to whoever is willing to answer.
Well, I can go first because leadership is, of course, one of the issues I identified in the Ministry of the Armed Forces in France, for example. So especially in a certain defense organization. We do have very competent civil servants, and I'm really sure that within the Ministry of the Armed Forces, we have the competence to work on climate risk and on climate security risks. But the issue is we don't have the coordination and we don't have the leadership on the issue, especially coming from the French, the Chief of Defense Staff and coming from the ministry itself, but also coming from the high rank officials in the military. So that would probably take time, but there is no one in charge, actually. And there is no one in charge of climate security or no one in charge of these issues that is clearly identified and who has the leadership, actually, who has the charisma and the will to work on these issues. So it's not a matter of competence, I would say, in the case of the Ministry of the French Ministry of the Armed Forces, but it's a matter of really, it's a very good question, it's a matter of leadership. I feel like in the US, the problem is, there is a different problem. There are leaders, in a way, within the Department of Defense, that they have leaders in certain areas in climate security, is the case. So they have this task force now. But the problem is, how do you build competence? Who do you bring to the table? Who do you work with? And I think the IMCCS and the Center for Climate and Security do a good job identifying who works on what and who should work with who, actually. So I think the problem is quite different in France and in the US. And at the international level, it's a different matter, right? I mean, leadership is a tricky question when it comes to international relations. But of course, the fact that, as Erin said, NATO, the EU and the US are back in the international negotiations will, of course, have a huge impact on the discussions and especially on the climate security aspects of the discussions. Leadership is not all, but it's very important. I think it's a very critical element in the discussion.
Thank you, Adrien. Would someone else would like to complement this view on leadership?
I have just a small point to add to that, which I thought was exactly right. Well, the first is that I think you're seeing increasing leadership on these issues from, ministries of defense and from the Department of Defense here in the US. And that is different than I think maybe 10 years ago, if people were talking about these issues, it was more in the foreign ministries. In State Department sort of working on that side. And so it was hard to sort of get military leaders themselves taking these issues seriously or integrating them into their work, right? And so that's part of the need that IMCCS identified, right? Is that we need to be having these conversations with hard security leaders because these are issues of hard security just as much as they are of diplomacy and development. On that note, though, I think the important thing is that you have simultaneous and integrated conversations across those 3Ds of defense, development, and diplomacy, because what we don't want is the military to get out really far ahead on this and then be leaving sort of the development experts whose job it is to build resilience to a lot of these threats or to find solutions to them in the dust. So I think that's something we're constantly talking about when we're talking about leadership, is leadership at all levels and prioritized in such a way that all aspects of an administration, all different types of security leaders are a part of that conversation.
Thank you so much, Kate. And it's actually a great connection to the next question. You mentioned the fact that we do indeed need to address climate change in very different arrays of policymaking. And we have a question from Arthur Fatou asking you guys that for a development point of view, what kind of investments, social investments or infrastructure maybe, should be prioritized by policymakers to try to ramp up resilience, as you said, and contain the social risks that will come with climate change? Not an easy question. Who would like to go? Erin, go ahead.
Sure. I mean, I guess I'll speak more generally to the question, but I think when talking about resilience, it's really important to think both about the tangible forms of resilience, right? Like building higher seawalls or strengthening other flood issues, but as well as the intangible forms of resilience, like trust in government, social cohesion. All of those things in the more intangible side, I think, are actually perhaps more important, and where more risk exists right now in terms of potential for violence and conflict a lot of places. And those aren't really climate questions per se, they are governance questions. And that's why I think it's so important to bring a climate lens to some of these governance issues and vice versa, so that when you're thinking about building resilience, it really isn't just focused on those physical things, but instead focused on social things. And I think development programs need to take that into account. And instead of measuring number of wells drilled or whatever the hard tangible things are, but instead thinking about how you change approaches within societies. Because when you look at water risk, when you look at resource risk, when you look at risks related to internal migration and tensions they can cause, a lot of those are driven by governance dynamics. And when you layer the climate shocks on top of that, then that's when the real challenges emerge. So I would think that has to be and that's where I see a big gap, frankly, in a lot of work.
Thank you, Erin. Anyone else would like to go on this question and what developments and policymakers should prioritize?
I would agree with Erin, and I would add the issue of education. Of course, education is key. And education to resilience could be just learning about climate change when you're at school, or learning how to deal with reduction of resources or certain climate risk at school. I mean, it's part of the issue. And we're not here to say that the only solution is a military solution, not at all. I mean, it's a cross-cutting issue, so we need all government to get involved. And as Kate said, we took a long time to bring the ministries of the armed forces to work on that. Now they are here, but they should not go ahead. And you're perfectly right. And of course, we need everybody involved, and the education is key. And justice, I would add the issue of justice is key as well. Should be aware of who we should prioritize maybe when we talk about climate resilience, and what are the areas in each territory that are at risk, and who lives here. I mean, that's broad discussion, but of course it's part of the issue.
Thank
I'll
you.
just add, Sophia, if it's okay, one other small thing, because I think while we're focused on sort of what goes wrong if we don't solve climate change, or as we haven't solved climate change, sort of what happens, I think also so important for building resilience is bending the curve of global emissions, right? And we can't let go of that issue, because every 10th of the degree matters, frankly. The IPCC said that, but especially for security outcomes, continued warming just means that they get worse and worse and worse, right? So as part of resilience, part of development is also lowering emissions, building clean energy and transportation infrastructure, all the rest that can also withstand the climate shocks that are already here. So we can't let our eye off of that ball of mitigating the climate threat itself, while we're also thinking about mitigating the security repercussions of the warming we already have. And that's unfortunate, it's tough, but it's necessary from a security perspective.
Thank you. Thank you all for those enlightening answers. And I think we're really lucky to have you all at this table to be able to have such a perspective. Another question that is being asked by the audience and is specifically on climate insecurity in relation to finance. We have a question, someone asking us, for example, has cost projection been done on climate impacts to military infrastructures? So the cost of climate change for militaries. Would anyone like to go?
I can just jump in from the US perspective. That's certainly part of what the US military has been doing. They have a tool to evaluate climate risk at each of their installations. Congress has required them to do these installation assessments of climate risk, and part of that is absolutely the cost. And part of what we have focused on at the Center for Climate and Security was looking for opportunities where there's an opportunity to save, right? By making installations more resilient on the front end and choosing, right, to site something at perhaps a slightly higher elevation from the get-go, and how that can save money. But especially in the US and in the congressional context, where money is always a key part of the conversation, that is a lot of what Congress has pushed the Defense Department to do, is look at those cost trade-offs.
Thank you, Erin. Anyone else would like to go?
Yeah, we should not forget the insurance companies as well. I mean, the insurance companies will play a huge part in the future efforts, and especially when I talked about justice, when we talk about risk management and insurance. Let's be careful here. I mean, we should probably have this discussion now, because the cost of climate resilience will be huge, especially in certain areas for certain people. So, of course, the finance will be a key issue, and the insurance companies are already, I would say, I'm sure of it, working on how to share the cost of climate resilience among societies. So that's a very interesting question.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Adrien. And indeed, the financial impact of climate change, the cost of staying here and doing nothing, is definitely something should be looking into. We now have two questions on maybe more regional matters. The first one is asking for suggestion on how to start talks and action around climate security in the MENA region, which stands for Middle East and North Africa. So how could we advance climate security in this region?
Maybe I can start, and this is a very difficult question because we're not part of administration, not in France and not in the US. But what I will say for the French side is that we have several arenas for discussion with MENA countries. So we have the 5+5 summit with the north part of Africa, the northern part of Africa. And that, considering that the Mediterranean Sea is one of the hotspots for climate change, and it's in the Mediterranean, the temperature is increasing twice as fast as in the rest of the world, and it will face, and it has already faced, as we've seen this summer, many droughts and fires. So there is a place to talk about climate security with the North African countries from the French perspective. With the Middle East, I think some of them have already integrate climate change into their military or their defense consideration. We can talk about Jordan, who's considering water stress as a major impact of climate change on its operations. And I think there is a way to talk about that because they will be impacted by climate change really in a really harsh way in the next few years. And there is a need to talk about it. So I'm sure arenas for discussions are open. And again, we come to the question of leadership. Who is going to start speaking about that, and for which goals?
Thank you, Julia. Erin, you want to go? Sure.
Sure. Just a few different points. One is I do think at the World Leaders Climate Summit that the U.S. hosted in April, I believe it was the Minister of Defense from Iraq spoke on the climate security panel led by Secretary of Defense Austin. So I thought that was a good sign to have that engagement there. I think also there are opportunities we've seen in a lot of the climate security research that potential opportunities for technical cooperation between countries, right, on scientific matters around water sharing, around other issues, and bringing parties that differ on other issues together around the table on perhaps issues that aren't as fraught, right? Scientific basis can be a good opportunity to build peace. So I think that's something to think about when it comes to the Middle East. And then the last thing I'll say, and this is perhaps not as positive a note, something I just noted this summer throughout the region. I've noted it in Algeria, I think also in Turkey, where when climate shocks hit those countries, the leadership used the opportunity to blame groups that are already marginalized, right? So in Turkey, you saw blaming the Kurds for the wildfires. And in Algeria, I think you saw the government blame what they called terrorist groups that were linked to Israel and Morocco. And I think this type of climate security risk is one we need to look at in terms of when governments who are already struggling to manage these crises get hit. How do they react? And do they react in such a way that actually exacerbates tensions and puts groups that are already in a bad place in further marginalizing them? And how can that exacerbate risk, I think, is something that really needs to be looked at, not only in the Middle East, but in many parts of the world. But it did, I've noted it a few different places in the Middle East over the summer, and I think it's worth exploring a bit more.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Erin. We now have another question asking you guys what you would think of setting up an interagency climate security governance, meaning to expand and not just have an MOD, so Ministry of Defense governance and leadership. So what would you think of expanding that to other agencies?
Yeah, I can jump in and say I think this is essential. I think it's completely essential. I think it's critical within a domestic government as well as across at the multilateral level as well. And it's frankly because we've had a lot of discussions with military leaders on these issues, with diplomatic leaders. And the first thing that I think somebody says from the armed forces is that this is not our problem to solve, right? This is not the problem of the military, who has a very specific mission and very specific sort of rules guiding those missions. It's not their job to stop climate change, to solve climate change, all the rest. However, as Erin said, they're increasingly seeing climate risks impacting their work, and that will not stop, right? So if we're going to sort of approach these risks in the interconnected way that they are presenting, we have to do so with that sort of interministerial collaboration. And obviously that is sometimes harder than others, but with any of these types of risks that are actorless, that are only growing over time, we need to start building this infrastructure now that can respond in a way that is sort of interregional as well as cross-functional, but also be planning for the future to come. I think this is a really important aspect of what IMCCS sort of works with policymakers to say is we can give you a snapshot of the climate risks right now, but we increasingly need to be looking at the climate risks that are coming 10, 20 years from now, because those are the ones that we need to be building infrastructure for. And that's physical infrastructure, but that's also institutional infrastructure. So it's just to say, I mean, I couldn't agree with the premise of the question more. And I think that you're starting to see some signs of this. We've seen a little bit of this interaction happening in the US and other governments, but it needs a lot more and a lot faster sort of work to build.
And on the French side, I also agree with that, especially when we consider the different concepts of security that we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar. The military is only a part of those different concept of security. And when we think about human security, for example, or interior security, you have the ministry for example, who is in charge of handling fires and handling water stress on a territory, who is in charge of handling the electricity network or the freshwater networks. And all those infrastructure will be affected by climate change. And those departments, those ministries need to work together on climate change impacts on their mandates and how they will have to work together to mitigate those impacts or to anticipate those impacts and have crisis response to them. And I think it's really urgent because, for example, in France, the Ministry for Ecological Transition is in charge of water, electricity, and other networks, when the Economy Ministry is in charge of the internet network, and they need to talk. Only for that, they need to talk because one is depending on the other, and those two could be hit by climate change and by extreme weather events. There is a need to also have transversal discussion between the Ministry for Interior Affairs and the Ministry for Foreign Affairs, the Ministry for Armed Forces and the Ministry for Economy and Agriculture. So there is an urgent need. Unfortunately, it's still not the case here in France.
Thank you. Anyone? Yeah, Adrien, of course. Go ahead.
I just wanted to add that, I mean, Erin talked about different definitions of security. And of course, now we see that we go beyond just national and human security. We are talking about ecological security, planetary security. So basically, it goes beyond the previous conceptions of security and this odd division we had between, I would say, what threatens populations, what threatens states, what threatens ecosystems. Now we talk about what threatens, I mean, the earth and basically where we live, okay, as humans, but also all the non-humans that inhabit Earth. So that new conception of security that comes from, I mean, Earth system science and this area of study shows us that it's silly to only talk about one sector and one approach. It's a whole of government approach, and it should involve everyone in the discussion, as much people as we can, because we're talking about ecological security, about planetary security.
Thank you so much, Adrien, for enlightening us also on that. I think it's a very interesting evolution into, well, international studies, seeing how the concept of security is evolving within our age. And well, we're now coming to the end of the webinar. Thank you to everyone for the questions. Thank you to all our panelists for the participation. So we've seen that France and the US started integrating these issues, but they are not the only one. It's been done at the UN Security Council, and it's been done within NATO, starting to gain importance at the highest political levels. But as has been said by all the panelists, there's a big challenge coming ahead, institutional challenges also that will need to be addressed. And for that, research is key. Research on climate is evolving rapidly, and research on climate security will also need to evolve as we come within age. And this is why we were really happy to be organizing this webinar that really aims to foster cooperation between researchers on the two sides of the Atlantic, of course, but beyond that, it's of utmost importance, as all of you here have said, cooperation will be key and is key already now. So thank you again for your time. Thanks again to the US Embassy also for the support, and to the IRIS event team for organizing this webinar. Don't hesitate to reach out to myself or any of the panelists. I will make sure to forward the questions you have. And also don't hesitate to check out the website of the French Institute for International and Strategic Affairs, as well as the one as the Center for Climate and Security, for going more deeply into our work, and follow us for new reports and studies we might do. Thank you again for being here, and see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And the video will be available in 2 weeks on YouTube for those who want to see us again.
Great. Bye.
Bye.